So, welcome to our first panel session of the day, presenting SCRAP's Treaty on General and Complete Disarmament, the Global Weapons Tracking Portal, and feminist approaches to disarmament. I'm Rhys, a SCRAP project assistant, and I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Dan Plesch, SCRAP's director, Henrietta Wilson, SCRAP's lead researcher in global weapons tracking, and Nancy Ehrenberg-Peters, a SCRAP assistant working on the feminist disarmament project. At the end of the presentations, there will be time for a Q&A, and we'll be taking questions from here in the room and also online. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Professor Dan Plesch. He is Professor of Diplomacy and Strategy at SOAS University of London, where he leads the strategic concept for the removal of arms and proliferation, and is a door tenant at the legal chambers of 9 Bedford Row in London. His research expertise spans disarmament and human rights. His books include Women and the UN, A New History of Women's International Human Rights, Human Rights After Hitler, and America, Hitler, and the UN, How the Allies Won World War II. So, over to you, Dan.
Thank you. Hello, me again. I'm going to be popping up as a participant and as Master of Ceremonies during the day. One of our jobs in bringing this coalition together is to help to turn general disarmament from an ultimate goal, or as somebody said, an item on the list of hypocrisy issued by governments, into a concrete reality. And amongst what we like to call the precision tools that we've developed are a draft treaty framework text, which you find on our website and which you've already had some constructive comments on from Guatemala and other states about how we can improve it. And I bring this forward partly from experience of having been in a room with a smaller group, far smaller group than this, when the origins of the Arms Trade Treaty were being discussed, and when one of my board members said it was an impossible dream when he had been at CIPRI, which was to do anything at all about small arms. Now, of course, and I remember when I was running an office in Washington, one of our interns then wrote what was, I think, the first ever study on ammunition and ammunition control. Now, small arms, the Arms Trade Treaty, they have grown apace from these small beginnings. I wouldn't say they are a tree. They are each of them minor forests, small forests in the international scene now. And it's with that experience that a number of us bringing this project forward are confident that with people in this room and your colleagues and networks outside of it, we can reinvigorate and make real a new special session on disarmament at the UN. And one thing we learned, I think 2 things I would learn as an NGO and as an academic. One is never to think that you're a state. That some of my colleagues will think, oh, well, we can do what states aren't doing. Well, states are states, and we are not. But on the other hand, we perhaps have some expertise to be able to offer not just suggestions, but some draft text for people to work on. And that is what we've done with the SCRAP Treaty. And what we have done in a colloquial way is to look at all the effective paragraphs of historic disarmament agreements. Some still in operation, for example, the START Treaty, just still remaining, the INF Treaty, which few people would note has removed thousands of missiles that President Putin could be firing into Western Ukraine at the present time. That these were removed completely, and even after violations and the ending of the treaty, there hasn't been a large-scale replacement of these weapons. So the operative paragraphs of these agreements of on small arms of the ECOWAS West African provisions on small arms, of initiatives in Latin America, these all lend themselves to global application. And I think working with colleagues in Oxfam who are expert in these areas, we can look at some of these conditionalities and perhaps also consider that the presumption of legal and illicit is one that we perhaps need to revisit, that we need unequivocal universal controls, not simply a division of who is right and who is wrong in the world. And I think that perhaps the romantic period of humanitarian intervention, there are not so many states around who can claim simply to be the good guys. So bringing together these existing provisions from START, from INF, from the now decayed provisions of the European security architecture, which provided for the control over 20, 30 years of all armed forces in the wider Europe. And we argued, and at the time we didn't get an audience, but I think we should now. We know how to do this. We have the practice. States and the international tensions may have decided that a number of these agreements should be discarded. But today, with the declining security environment, we do not have to start from scratch. When we talk to governments, to parliamentarians, in our contacts with the Interparliamentary Union, and with simply members of the public and the media, we can say, in large part, we know how to do this. The agreements that you decided you no longer needed actually provide you with a large amount of the detail for the control and regulation of armaments. But to be clear, what we do and are not doing in our proposal, what it proposes is the elimination of weapons of mass destruction. Now, chemical weapons are pretty much covered and played an important part in making the Syrian conflict not even worse than it was. The role of the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Biological Weapons Convention, whose stronger provisions are waiting in the wings to be implemented, and then, of course, the issue of nuclear armaments, where there is a considerable degree of energy, and we know this has not yet come to fruition. But if you look at the provisions, for example, we would recommend the international inspection regime on Iraq, imposed after 1990, was highly effective. The silver lining, if you like, of the disastrous and illegal Iraq invasion was that there were no WMD and that the inspectors of the UN had done their job. Well, those provisions, which are extremely intrusive, if applied to the weapon states, would, by and large, solve the problem of verification of nuclear disarmament, plus the expert work that has gone on in a number of initiatives, not least the UK Norwegian one. Now, the fourth category of WMD, as defined with respect to the Iraq conflict and others, is missiles. And I would want to put on the table, I wrote recently, and a colleague reminded me, that the then head of the Council on Foreign Relations, Alton Fry, in the 1980s, suggested a zero missiles policy. Now, if we're to take up the ambition that helped drive public opinion in the 1980s and helped end the Cold War, which was zero missiles in Europe, longer range missiles in Europe, and look at global application, that is the fourth category of WMD that we would suggest being eliminated down to really quite short ranges. Which then leaves the category of small arms and major conventional weapons. In the area of major conventional weapons, we in this draft text do not suggest elimination of every tank, warship, and artillery piece on the planet. You think, oh, well, here's some realism then, even a little bit. But what we do suggest is the application of what we might say is OSCE plus, and a number of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. These provisions which worked effectively in the continent and saved taxpayers a huge amount of money in defence expenditure after the end of the Cold War. These provisions govern all necessary provisions for armies and air forces, and are, from a simply technical and drafting perspective, not complicated to apply to navies. Now, I say that cautiously, because there are plenty of navies, not least the United States Navy, which wouldn't be too keen on being regulated. We know that. But if you're looking at it from what is practical if you want to do it, these provisions, I think, are valid and that we offer to you for discussion. And somebody was saying we badly need an equivalent of the UN process on climate change, on climate chaos, which is not adequate, we know. But at least there is an active global continuing process endeavouring to reverse the effects of CO2 emissions, and an objective of going carbon free, of zero by 2050. Well, what we're suggesting is a practical agenda for weapons control on a similar sort of model. And we think that perhaps can be appealing to publics and politicians. And when it comes to, of course, weapons which are killing people day to day in large quantities, often it is the category of small arms. And I remember some 30 years ago when we started work on these issues, and when our colleagues at CIPRI said it was just too hard. Well, we have come some way, not adequately. But I think if we look at the best practice and the suggestions for small arms control, then these can provide us with good measures in this regard as well. So I perhaps have abused my position as chair, as a leader, and taken too much time. But that is what we are offering in the draft treaty, and we hope that that will help concentrate minds when we ask member states and NGOs to support a decision at the General Assembly to activate the fourth special session on disarmament, which has been on the books of the UN, ready to go for, as Azumi Nakamitsu said, for several decades now. Thank you very much, Rhys.
Thanks, Dan. I'd now like to introduce our second speaker, who's Henrietta Wilson, who's going to be speaking about the weapons tracking portal. Henrietta is a freelance researcher and educator. She researches military technologies and global arms regulations, and teaches politics and international relations at UK universities. Originally trained as a physicist, her career spans 3 decades of collaboration with major NGOs and universities in the UK and Germany. She is currently working with the Scrap Weapons Project, researching the possibilities of global weapons tracking through open source research, and is a visiting research fellow at King's College London.
Thank you very much, Rhys. Can you hear me, everybody? Brilliant, thank you very much. Yeah, my name's Henrietta Wilson. I'm absolutely delighted to be here, and I'm extremely grateful to all of you for coming, for Dan's interesting comments, and for all the organisers. So as Dan mentioned, Dan mapped out a possible way forward for thinking about general and complete disarmament from almost a political point of view. I'm going to be backing this up, but with a look at disarmament technologies, and whether and how these can be harnessed within wider disarmament processes, and some words about what the Scrap team is doing in this sort of area. So, as has been mentioned a couple of times now, the last special session on disarmament was all the way back in 1988. Since then, we know there's been a huge transformation in digital technologies. Even for those of us who weren't there at the time, I'm sure we know that before the internet, things were very different. We found information in very, very different ways. And so the transformation in digital technologies has really fueled a new generation of open source research. By that, I mean research that uses publicly available tools and information. And as I hinted, before the internet, people were doing this. people were scanning newspapers, they were tracking down reports from parliaments and think tanks and putting it all together, and even having global networks through the post and the telephone. Now, thanks to the internet, this space has completely changed. The internet makes getting information from traditional media much easier. We now can get global news very, very easily. Sometimes we have to pay for it, but it is there, publicly available. The internet also gives access to brand new data points, like information from satellite imagery or from social media posts, and it also gives us tools to manage large quantities of data and process it. Things like, I'm thinking about spreadsheets that help collect and collate different data, and communications technologies that enable collaborations between huge numbers of people across huge distances, as well as visualizations. There's a lot of different ways to collect and analyze information now. So what? So I'm now going to outline 3 different ways that I think this is making a difference to the sort of area that we're interested in today. First of all, this new open source research gives us a whole new set of monitoring capabilities. It used to be the case that a few well-resourced states could see things in a significantly different way to other groups. So only governments had access to satellites not too long ago. Now, this new digital open source research means that non-governmental groups and individuals and under-resourced states could have capabilities that were previously undreamt of. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Bellingcat, a non-governmental organisation, were the group that broke news on the chemical weapons uses in the UK, in Syria, and against the Russian opposition politician Navalny. Another non-governmental group, Federation of American Scientists, were among the groups that broke the news about new Chinese nuclear weapons. And ACLED, another non-governmental group, has been exposing political violence that links weapons uses in Yemen to the arms trade, the global arms trade. So the main message from this first kind of so what point I'm making is that there are now more people that can see more events globally. So the second way that I want to highlight that this new resource makes a difference is it gives enhanced transparency. And transparency in the past has been very important to achieving disarmament goals. It's linked to improved prosecutions and accountability when people violate agreements. It's linked to reductions in corruption. It's also, during the Cold War, simple transparency exchanges were linked to reduced tensions between the US and the USSR. And it's also been linked to really robust, irreversible disarmament. So the idea is, if antagonists know more about what they're doing, what each other's doing, it builds confidence, it builds trust, it facilitates the environment that you need for disarmament, and it facilitates the environment you need to stay disarmed. So transparency can help, and open source research can help achieve transparency. The third factor that I want to indicate of where it makes a difference is an idea that maybe open source research could help verification, could help treaty verification. So verification is formally defined as the systems by which states parties to treaties build confidence in each other's compliance. And at times, verification also means systems which can identify non-compliance of treaties. That's not always the case, but in some cases it is. And through the history of achieving robust arms control, non-proliferation and disarmament, there's been collective agreement that the desirability, the achievability of different measures is often linked to perceptions of how verifiable they are. So if people don't want treaties to happen, they often say, oh, but they're not verifiable. So the phenomena of open source research really raises questions about, could open source research be a way of filling this desire for verification? Could it fulfill the verification gap? And I think that's a space we at Scrap are exploring very carefully. I should mention in our research, there are some provisos, there are some limits to what we can expect from open source research. The first is to say that not all transparency is good transparency. There's research that shows that at some times people can achieve better political outcomes by keeping secrets, keeping a level of ambiguity. And too much transparency can actually close down policy options at times. There's also a number of ethical dilemmas embedded in open source research. For example, who gets to decide what's being looked at? Who gets to decide what will be published when? How can you protect witnesses or protect proliferation-sensitive material? There are some sensitivities there. The other proviso that I'd say is that open source research is not identical to verification, and we shouldn't accidentally slip into this idea that open source research can do all of verification. Verification needs to be agreed by states, and as Dan said, we are not states. The states have to work out their own systems for themselves. And more than that, open source research does something a little bit different. Lots of the non-governmental work in this area is decentralized and benefits from that. There's redundancies, there's creativity in the system. So there are some limitations, but I would point out that the scale of current open source research is such that it suggests it's going to be unignorable, that all sorts of groups are finding out all sorts of information, and the international community, the thought leaders that Nakamitsu referred to, would be advised to really think about how it can be harnessed so that it can be maximised and any dangers can be minimised. So very quickly, I'm going to say some very quick words about the Scraps work that's been going on in this area. Well, first of all, we've been researching the significance of these developments in the sort of way that I've been kind of cherry picking just now. We've got a number of publications and we've got a book that's going to be coming out sometime soon. We've also been really pleased to have a chance to work with students from Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Massachusetts who've built us a prototype global weapons tracking portal, which you can see on our website, which really acts as a directory into groups that are tracking weapons and weapons uses globally. And we've also tried to support the development of the global epistemic community that's interested in weapons tracking. We ran some webinars, again you can get that through our website, and interactive cafes to try and help practitioners build links with each other and share best practice. So that's all from me now. Thank you very much for listening. I think I gave you a really big whistle-stop tour, so I'm very much looking forward to any questions and discussions either in this panel or in the breaks. Thank you very much, Rhys.
Thanks very much indeed, Henrietta. And so lastly, I'd like to introduce Nancy Ehrenberg-Peters, who's going to be talking about the Feminist Disarmament Project. Nancy is a project assistant at Scrap. She co-leads the research and coordination of Scrap's Feminist Disarmament Project and previously co-led Scrap's Strategic Stability Project. Together with two colleagues at Scrap, she is also guest editing a special issue of ZEFCO, the German Journal on Peace and Conflict, which examines global disarmament, peace and conflict, and integrates the role of gender perspectives, and in particular, those of women from the global south. Nancy is currently completing an MSc in violence, conflict, and development here at SOAS, specializing in conflict, post-conflict reconstruction, and peace in the Middle East. So over to you then, please.
Thank you, Rhys, and thank you, Henrietta and Dan, for opening there. Can everyone hear me as well? Yeah. So my name is Nancy, and I'm a project assistant at Scrap, and I co-lead the Feminist Disarmament Project. And it's really great to be here with you all today, and I look forward to hearing from other amazing speakers later on. So Dan and Henrietta spoke about Scrap's work developing a framework for a treaty and possible verification tools. Now, today I'm going to speak about the practical implementation of disarmament on the ground in communities which are wrecked by violence because of the proliferation of weapons and armed conflict, and to really, justify the urgency behind holding a UN special session on disarmament. So a little bit of background first. In 2019, I co-founded the Feminist Disarmament Project at Scrap. And throughout the 2 years, we've had the privilege of collaborating with 34 experts, the majority of whom are women from the Global South. And we started the project by launching a 7-part webinar series, and each webinar kind of focused on a different area, such as the practical and financial obstacles facing women in entering the field and contributing to its deliberations, also women's contributions in negotiating and implementing the TPNW, etc. And I'll speak a bit more about those in a second. And the webinar series was very well and widely received. For the first 2 webinars alone, people from over 48 different countries tuned in to watch the live recordings, which amounted to over 300 attendees, which doesn't include the hundreds more views we received via YouTube for the recordings there, which are still available also on our website if anyone here is interested. And throughout the project, we have worked very hard, my Scrap colleagues and myself, to try and ensure that underrepresented voices, especially of women from the Global South, are heard. And I believe that our webinar series was unique for this reason, because many of the speakers, not all of them, but many of the speakers we heard from did not have a global platform, even though they should. But it was really important to us to ensure that they were heard. So just to give you a little bit of a flavour of the women, the amazing women and organisations we've had the privilege to collaborate with and learn from, I'm just going to mention a couple of them here. So we've had the privilege of working with a non-violent activist who led a global women peacemakers across the demilitarized zone from North Korea to South Korea, campaigning for a formal end to the Korean War. We've also worked with UN representatives from Trinidad and Tobago and Costa Rica, who are at the forefront of facilitating and negotiating Resolution 65/69 in the TPNW. We've worked closely also with women from Cameroon, Sudan, and Nicaragua, who explained how the conflicts in their local communities are fueled by the illicit proliferation of small arms and light weapons. And they spoke about how their work included ensuring that women and feminist perspectives are embodied in the disarmament work in their local communities, such as by building capacity of communities through training, raising awareness and education initiatives, and creating a culture of peace and conflict resolution through different creative strategies, including singing in their local communities about peace and disarmament, and also advocating for the end of the use of child soldiers. We have also worked with a civil society practitioner from Lebanon, who has been a key figure advancing global agendas such as women, peace and security into a more localized discourse, and who is also a member of the Arms Control Coalition in the Middle East and North Africa region. We have also learned so much from an educationist and founding director of the Indian-based organisation Women in Security, Conflict Management and Peace, which promotes the leadership of South Asian women in disarmament. And finally, we ran a webinar in which we collaborated with UN Lyric on the role of women from Latin America and the Caribbean in implementing disarmament through multilateral treaties, diplomatic efforts, and advocacy at the civil society level, with a particular focus on the disarmament of conventional weapons. I will just move on to the second part of my presentation by talking about how the webinar series I just overviewed really inspired us to take this project take it forward, and what else can we do with it. So myself and Henrietta and our Scrap colleague Yanis are co-editing a special issue for ZEFCO, the German Journal on Peace and Conflict Studies. and it's due to be published at some point next year. The title of the special issue is Gender and Disarmament, Feminist Approaches to Arms, Arms Control, Disarmament and Their Role in Peace and Conflict. And perhaps self-explanatory from the title, but this special issue adopts a gender approach to disarmament policy and practice and violence. And we aim to showcase the nuanced perspectives and diverse perspectives of the misuse and proliferation of violence and disarmament efforts aiming to mitigate these pernicious outcomes. And I'll just run over quickly a couple of the key findings or themes that have come to light both through the webinar series and also our special issue. As I have already touched on, the first key theme really underpinning our research here is that global efforts to promote disarmament are heterogeneous. We must avoid a one-dimensional lens applied to understanding gender and disarmament, for example, in this case. And I know Dan also talked about also avoiding a one-dimensional lens for, considering illicit and licit dichotomies. So, yes, there's not just one way to be a feminist, and there's not just one perspective from the global south. We have to break down these artificial and socially constructed boundaries that we attribute to our understanding of gender and disarmament. And secondly, another key theme that's underpinned and has come to light in a lot of the papers in the special issue is how many policies which aim to achieve greater diversity, such as by increasing the number of women involved in certain activities, can in fact reinforce the status quo rather than actually achieve disarmament, and therefore can ultimately serve to ensure violence and destruction. So just to round up now, thank you very much for listening to me today. I guess just a takeaway from my presentation is that people living in violent communities across the world want general and complete disarmament. For them, it's a realistic and achievable proposition. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Nancy. That was great. And thank you to all our panelists for their very informative and important presentations. So we have about 10 minutes now for questions. If you'd like to ask a question online, please type your question in the Q&A text box there. But perhaps first of all, we could take a question from in the room. Does anyone have a question? The gentleman here, please.
Hi. Question for Alison.
Oh, could you wait for a moment? Sure.
Oh, there's a mic just coming now.
Hi there. Question for Alison. The open source methods for more challenging, I would guess, investigations. When we're looking at, for instance, China and Taiwan, and how a better understanding of the capabilities of both sides might help prevent further escalations or deteriorations of relations. Is there anything, is there active research in that area?
Thank you for the question. So the question, I think, was, are people watching China and Taiwan? Is that right? I don't have any concrete examples to share with you just now, but I'd be amazed if people weren't watching. And I think your question raises really interesting follow-on points about how visible different things are to different sorts of monitoring technologies and how those monitoring technologies can be evaded. So a big theme of our work is that technologies often help. They won't do everything. They won't solve a political problem or a kind of entrenched antagonism between communities. So, for example, overhead satellite technologies, they can see ever such a lot. And in some cases, in for example, nuclear weapons, there are absolute signatures that differentiate between a weapons program and peaceful uses. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's technically plausible. But in other weapon systems, it's much less easy to distinguish between those things. And even in the nuclear side of things, there are limits to what the technologies can do, because a cloudy day will obscure imagery. Syria, with its nuclear weapons program, put it in a big building. So what open source does for us is it also gives us a kind of way around these to an extent, in that it's often not really aiming to get single, categorical, unambiguous evidence of one thing. It's very multidimensional. So people are coordinating and comparing and cross-referencing lots of different data points to build up a picture of a likely scenario. So I think it does give visibility to things that otherwise would be pretty opaque. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, do you want to follow up? Yeah.
I think, though, that there are political and sometimes semi-conscious decisions by governments, and particularly by the news media, about what one allows into the picture. And I think Taiwan and China is a tremendous example. The D-Day landings were carried out by Allied United Nations forces who had complete air superiority, complete naval supremacy and had to sail across some 30 miles. And then they came quite close to failing against the German forces. And many of the beaches were open, sandy Normandy beaches. In the situation of Taiwan, there's a distance of over 100 kilometers. No one in any of the scenarios sees that the Chinese would have anything like air or sea superiority. And then Taiwan is a largely urbanized island. So assuming the Chinese do get ashore, then they find themselves immediately engaged in urban warfare. Now, that calculation is extremely simple to work out. Similarly, that the West and China's adversaries outspend China by something like 8-1. All the scenarios assume somehow that the Americans have their hands tied behind their back and Japan is not involved, let alone South Korea. Which isn't to say that I have anything to say for the government in Beijing, but all the data in the world isn't useful if analysts choose to exclude it. So, who writes in the Western media that NATO outspends Russia by at least 10-1? All we hear about is we must increase by another 2% or 3%. So an analysis is critical, and I think to some extent it is sorely lacking, and the Taiwan Straits issue is a case in point. So forgive me for perhaps putting the downer on the data side of it. The data is only valid if we choose to use it, and I think there is a tragic failure in analysis with respect particularly to that issue.
Thanks very much, Dan. We have a question from Michael Goodman online, which is, to what extent is Israel's nuclear program being monitored through the open source method?
Thank you for the question. I mean, I think, like I said for the previous question, I'm not going to go into details of who's watching what. There are groups doing that. I would point you to our Global Weapons Tracking portal for an example, for lots of examples of people who are watching different parts of the world. And one of the interesting things about open source research practitioners that I've come across is that they don't always restrict themselves to particular examples in that sort of way, to particular geographical areas or issue areas. A lot of the community is essentially collaborative. They pivot very quickly. And so when there are developments in Israel, the news that we consume will have come from these open source researchers, and they'll have come from a bank of people that you will be familiar with. Bellingcat, the New York Times Investigative Unit, there's a group called Forensic Architecture, based in London University. Our Global Weapons Tracking portal will give you links to a lot of these groups, and they will be pivoting to look at these questions when they get signals, when they get red flags from maybe social media. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
If I might lob in, the portal which we've developed for our questionnaire, in a sense, is a do-it-yourself kit. Not quite IKEA, but your local hardware store equivalent of tools. If you want to look at Israel or Pakistan or whatever, or Britain, then there are tools there to enable you to do that and to look at current studies by NGOs and match them against what you find out yourself in looking at satellite imagery, at tracking aircraft and naval movements and so forth. So what we're doing is to try to develop a public access store for people wishing to carry out this work and demonstrate also the viability of something like this on the global scale for governments.
Thanks, Dan. Do we have any other questions in the room or online? This gentleman here, if you could bring the microphone down, please.
Good morning. I'm the second secretary of Russian embassy in London, and you know, the speakers said about the importance of verification. And as we know, there is a biological weapons convention. It bans the type of weapons of mass destruction, but there is no verification under the convention, and it is a problem. In November, in Geneva, it will be organized a review conference of the BWC. And maybe it can be adopted a legally binding protocol to the convention with effective mechanism of verification. This initiative is on the table, as I know. What do you think about it? Thank you.
Who would like to answer this?
Sorry, could you repeat the question about the review conference? I didn't get the specifics of that.
Yeah, sure. In November, in Geneva, it will be organized the review conference. And some group of states propose to adopt a legally binding protocol with effective mechanism of verification under the convention. What do you think about it?
Well, as Dan said, that's sort of up to the states party to the Biological Weapons Convention, isn't it? And we know there's, you know, it's notoriously a tricky, a thorny issue, thinking about verification in that context, because the dual use overlap between biological weapons and legitimate uses is huge and extremely diffuse, and biological weapons programs could, in theory, be very small and very easy to hide. I would expect the review conference to mention the Article 5 process that's currently underway, where I understand Russia has launched a formal mechanism about its allegations into bioweapons activities in Ukraine. I know that there's lots of research being done on that about the disinformation around claims. So I think that's probably maybe what's going to shape the debate around that. I don't know if you may have more insights than I do. I'd be interested to talk to you about that.
Thanks very much. I think there was one more question from a gentleman at the back. Is that right? The gentleman in the middle. Sorry, sir. Did you have a question?
Thank you very much to all the panelists. It's been very interesting so far. I have a quick question for Dan on the possible regulation on armament. How could you elaborate this a bit further and maybe tell us who would have to be on the boat? What kind of institutions had to be involved for this to be able to come into effect? Thank you.
A great question from an expert from Switzerland. The cop-out would be to say that in our draft text we probably would have some bracket would say subject to negotiation. I think if one looks at one of the defects of the Non-Proliferation Treaty is it doesn't have an operational secretariat, for example. On the other hand, if you look at the European security architecture, there are some quite well-developed secretariat functions, implementation functions. I think the starting point, I would say, for experts in states would be to look at what are the most effective mechanisms for implementation, and I think the OSCE is a starting point. There are other mechanisms which one might take as models. I think that there is a provision at one of our board members who backstopped and edited a treaty text for the State Department for most of his professional life, Piers Corden, and colleagues mentioned to me that one also might think about a provision for unilateral or small group of states entry into force provision, that we agree with our colleagues that this will enter into force as a means of building momentum. But clearly, I don't think one can look at these mechanisms and these provisions without looking at a combination of secretariat and inspection functions. And we would think that possibly the creation of a global weapons tracking portal service, and it was conversations we had with Hans Blix a few years ago about lessons from Iraq, and he introduced the idea to us of saying what one should create is not an inspection enforcement mechanism, which is fine if you can get it, but an inspection and verification service, rather different conception. Because unless you have a situation like Iraq where it's imposed by the will of the Security Council, you are looking at forms of consent. And I think what we are trying to do in this project is to say, people approach this issue by saying it is theoretically impossible. And what we want to say, it is theoretically highly practical if you want to do it. And that then changes the nature of the debate about how you think you can move forward. But we're not in any sense pretending that we have all of the answers. But if you push me against a wall with a microphone, as perhaps you're doing, I would say the OSCE provisions extended to conventional forces provides a pretty powerful place to start when you're looking at major conventional weapon systems. And right now, of course, we have this huge gap with let us say, the WMD crowd over here and the humanitarian small weapons over here, and nothing at all to deal with the major armaments of the general purpose forces of the world states. And that, I think, is something which is not acknowledged at all. And that if this project is nothing else, it highlights that issue. And I'm sorry if I've given you rather a lengthy answer. I'll happily discuss it in more detail informally, and we're delighted to sit down and sit in the room with a few colleagues and work on text. That's what we are here for. But it was a great question. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. But thank you for all your questions, and thanks again to our panel for their groundbreaking presentations. I would like to take this opportunity to encourage you all to sign Scrap's call for a special session on disarmament at the UN, which you can do online by using the QR codes which are displayed on the doors and around the room in the Brunei gallery. So thanks very much.